So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about what's the difference between a fetter and a longsword. A longsword is a two-handed sword that's um, from the late Middle Ages, and as the name implies, it's longer than a traditional one-handed sword, hence the name. A fetter is the training analog, both historically and in modern times, for the longsword. So you have a blade that has a flared handle section and then a long, thin blade, thinner than a normal sword in terms of width, and a blunt end with no cutting edge. Now, this part called the shield is here for a reason. Because this doesn't have the thickness of a normal blade, or the width of a normal blade, I should say, at the base, this provides a place to put your thumb on the back. That's wider than your thumb. If you see how thin it is here, or narrow it is here, that's not going to work very well. A lot of the false edge cuts involve putting your thumb on the back of the blade. With the normal blade, that's not an issue. This is so much thinner that if they didn't have a wider section down here, your thumb would be much more vulnerable. It also keeps blades away from your hand. When this design was developed, historically, this was what they used in the Middle Ages, or something very similar. People didn't have the synthetic gloves and padded gloves and protection that we have. They did have gauntlets, of course, but there's not really any indication they wore them when practicing. This keeps blades from, away from the crossguard, so they're less likely to pivot around it and hit the back of your hand at an angle. And like I said, it provides a place to put your thumb when you're rotating the blade. Another feature is because the blade is narrower this way, it doesn't have the mass to it, so this provides some weight in front of the guard to make it feel more like a real sword. Now let's look at a longsword, and this is really more of a bastard sword. The blade on a true longsword would be about 3 or 4 inches longer, probably. But this is what I used to use for practicing longsword before I got this. And you can see the hilt is a lot shorter, the crossguard is shorter, and the blade is shorter significantly. However, you can also see the blade is significantly wider, about as wide actually as the base of the shields on the fetter. If you look at the width here and the width here. And if you were to put your thumb up the back on this, it's plenty protected. You don't need a wider section on this because the blade is already a normal width. Now I will say that this is actually now a sharp. Since I don't need 2 blunt swords, and this I think was originally a sharp that had been ground down to make it blunt, I took it upon myself to sharpen the edges and to put a point back on it. So this is no longer suitable for practice, but great for chopping bottles. Now, what I said by a bastard sword, essentially a bastard sword is a one-handed length sword blade, or a blade close to a one-handed length sword blade on a two-handed sword hilt. So this hilt is clearly a two-handed length hilt. You can comfortably get 2 hands on there without using the pommel. The blade on this, however, is only like 32.5 inches long. Now, the blades on these fetters, this one's about 39 inches long, similar to the length on the Regagnés. These fetters tend to be longer than a historical longsword. But, okay, assuming a historical longsword had a 35 or 36 inch blade, that's still substantially longer than 32.5. So, I've seen one-handed medieval swords, what we call arming swords, with blades this long. So that's why I say this is more of a bastard sword than a true longsword. The blade in a longsword would probably be a little bit longer, say about that long. That said, this works like a slightly shorter longsword, and in that sense, especially looking at the hilt, if you look at the difference in the hilt between the two, you can see the difference. The crossguard on the fetter is longer, and the handle is longer. And the reason the crossguard is longer, I think, is the extra handle length. If you look at how one of these protects your hands, it's by angulation. This angle here is what provides the protection. If a sword strike was going to come down, the longer your handle is, the longer this has to be to get that angle down to there, to get that coverage. As to why these have longer handles, well, nowadays in practice we wear these big protective gloves. So your hands are effectively bigger, you're going to need a longer handle. They didn't have that back in the day. As to why, since by the time longswords came into being, a lot of people on the battlefield anyway did wear things like gauntlets, the question then becomes why didn't they have longer handles historically to accommodate the gauntlets? I think there's a very good reason for that. Let me put this back in its scabbard. If you were to wear a sword like this, it's cumbersome, but it's not that bad, right? Handle comes up to there. It sticks out about that much further than you, maybe a little further if you're slimmer than me, but it's not that bad, right? Now, you have a sword like this. The handle is like 2 inches longer, and the crossguard is longer on each side. What are you left with? This is going to be much more cumbersome to wear, and just all around stick out more and get in the way. Swords, remember, were sidearms. A longsword might not be, the most common sidearm compared to what we now call an arming sword, a one-handed sword. But the thing about a sword is, unlike an axe or a spear or something, you can wear it about town if you're allowed to. So, somebody could wear a sword of this with a handle of this length or shorter. It would be cumbersome to wear a sword with a handle much bigger, such as like this. And so, there's a reason that historical longswords had shorter crossguards and somewhat shorter handles. As to why these don't, the answer is obvious. These are practice tools. Nobody's going to wear a fetter sword around town because they're useless as I guess you could hit somebody with it, but, it's not going to cut. It's not a sword. It's specifically designed not to cut and not to hurt people. So, these were the practice weapon. They were kept either at home or in, fencing halls, or nowadays, somebody might keep it in a kit bag and transfer it between their house and the fencing club. But nobody's going to, well, people don't walk around with swords nowadays, but even in the medieval or Renaissance period, nobody walked around with one of these because it was a training tool. They would use this to train for the actual sword, which you could walk around with, and of course that had a slightly shorter handle. Now, the question, I guess, becomes, did the medieval ones have longer handles since they didn't have the protective gloves we have? And I honestly don't know. I do know that they were this shape. The question is, how much longer were their handles than the practice ones? No idea. But anyway, that's just some of the differences between a fetter and a longsword. And now that I have both a fetter and what's effectively a slightly short longsword, I figured I'd throw that out there because there are, this is the training tool for this, but they are very different. So, Lone Rider, out.